focus today, our conversation is about connecting our congregations through story. And as Pastor Richard and I were talking a little bit about what this story might be, or what this session might be, we talked about Jesus as being one of a great model of storyteller for us, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But as we're kind of still gathering a few more people into the session this morning, if you have a space to use in your chat, I'd love to hear a little bit about your favorite parable that Jesus shared. This one from Matthew 13, I'll read briefly here. The same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on a path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. If you have ears, hear." Jesus was notorious for telling parables and stories to crowds large and small. If you have a favorite parable or one that's kind of stuck with you over the years, I'd love to hear that in the chat. Go ahead and put those in there. Parable of the laborers in the vineyard. Yes, the woman at the well. These are great. One of my favorites is the filling of the oil of the jars with Elisha. It's a fantastic parable of God's abundance. The father and the two sons. Prodigal son, yes. Beverly, I love your comments about imagining ourselves in each of the characters' positions. The hidden treasure and the pearl, the good Samaritan. So many good parables to share. Go ahead, and as you think more, welcome to put more of those into the chat box. So I grew up on the rural plains of Nebraska, 8 miles from the nearest town of 1,200 people. My grandparents were our closest neighbors, a half-mile away. And this is a place where today cell service remains spotty, and cows still outnumber people 30-1. It is rural heartland prairie. It was in this place where my early faith was shaped. In Sunday school classes and summer church camps, I was learning about who God is and who I am in God. It was the stories of faith, stories of Gideon, who asked God for clarity by placing a fleece, of Eli and Samuel, and a God who shares their plan with a boy. Stories of Ruth and Esther, of walking on water and feeding of a multitude. I remember loads of verses I memorized over the course of my life. And at every stage, I wondered if what I was learning was true. Malachi and Hebrews declare that God is the same always and never changes. Could it be that God, who really knew me in my mother's womb, that all my days ordained for me were written in God's book before even one of them came to be? Was it really possible that a God who calms the seas and cares for the sparrow could also know the numbers of hairs on my head? Was it possible and simple as Proverbs suggested that by delighting yourself in the Lord, he will give you the desires of your heart? Was that meant literally or figuratively? I wondered. You might remember decades ago that it was common for banks and insurance agencies to gift their customers a wall calendar near the turn of the year. Likely you even received one of those yourself over the years. Those calendars showcased beautiful images of Americana, Rocky Mountains, lush farmland, forests, deserts, and ocean waterfronts. One year, when I was about 8 or 9, my parents didn't plan to use their calendar and offered it to me. Now, in the rural prairie of Nebraska, I spent hours, literally hours, with those pictures, imagining what it must be like to be present in each place. The most beautiful image, in my opinion, was an autumn photo of the Valley of Charleston, West Virginia. The vibrant reds and oranges and yellows of tree coverage, marked with the golden dome of the Capitol building, captivated me in a way that none other of the images could. This would be an amazing thing to see. It was the desire of my heart, I told God. Stories have carried Christian faith from generation to generation for thousands of years. Through them, we share the power of a creator, the hope of a savior. We tell biblical accounts again and again, year after year, through a liturgical calendar that reminds us of our own humanity, our need for redemption, and the promises for the future in this life and beyond. Stories do something that a telling of facts cannot do. Physically and emotionally, stories connect us in ways that are deep and intimate. We love stories through music, movies, books, podcasts. You probably have someone in your life who tells the best stories. I have a couple of those people in my life. Someone who makes the room just draw near with anticipation as they listen for the next story to unfold, even if they've heard that story many times. When we read or hear a story, a host of neurological things happen, causing a very different experience than when we encounter mere facts. Now, I won't go into the nerdy details here, but we'll simply say that story activates our brains in its entirety in a way that we can almost experience the story ourselves. It's as though we can feel the cold or the heat, the desperation or the elation that the story leads us through. We picture the setting, the people, we draw near. Internally, we transport ourselves into the story as a bystander or as a main character, watching, listening, waiting as a story and the events unfold. Stories have the power to move people. They help us understand and humanize circumstances that are unfamiliar to us. Jesus knew this. And he knew his audience when he likened God as a shepherd and the listener to lost sheep, or paralleled God to a woman searching fervently for a lost coin. These were stories that strongly resonated with listeners. They provided clarity and familiarity while reframing an understanding of God and who they were in God's view. And millennia later, these stories still resonate. Today, I find churches are often unable to tell the story of what God is doing in their midst. Stories churches do tell often sound more like resumes, founded in such and such a year, a series of pastors, membership counts, and building projects. It's factually accurate, delineates time, but this account does very little, if anything, to convey the impact of ministry, of a God who still moves among us, redeeming the world and inviting us to join in this work. Somewhere along the way, we have fallen to a place of taking for granted God's presence. We've forgotten that these moments are miraculous, that when we recognize them, sharing them builds up our collective faith. So where do we find stories? I get this question a lot. In part, we start by asking questions that get at the heart of the matter. These questions are a gift to our people. They enable us to reflect on what's happened, the transformation we might otherwise overlook. They create space to build relationship and community, to be vulnerable and pause, all ingredients that are sorely lacking in our day-to-day. And in this midst, we catch a glimpse of God at work and strengthen the cords of our faith. These questions, what were things like before this experience? How did this experience surprise you or change you? What are things like now, and how did that experience shape the way you think or live now? And one of my favorites, tell me more about that. A few years ago, when I was picking up my youngest daughter from Vacation Bible School, my friend and then director of youth and family ministry pulled me aside and she said, "Jennie, I have to tell you what happened this week." She said, "I had learned early in the week that one of the kindergarten students was having a hard time and really struggling. And so I went to find this kindergarten student. And as I turned the hall corner, I saw this kindergartner with one of our middle school volunteer helpers. They were sitting close together on the bench at the end of the hall, huddled together. And as I came closer, I recognized that they must be praying together. I paused and held back so that to disrupt them. And when they were finished, I checked in with both of them, the kindergartner smiling, feeling much more calm and eager to return to her Vacation Bible School class. The middle schooler feeling as though they had done something important. She said, "Jennie, this was what I hope for every time I do Vacation Bible School. I hope for a passing on of our faith. And when I do this, when we have Vacation Bible School, I expect that this will happen through the broad programming." But it was in this small, intimate encounter that I realized This is the passing on of our faith. This is what it's all about. I told her, Donna, you must tell the rest of the congregation this story. This is a story we should tell. It's more impactful than the announcement that 117 kids attended Vacation Bible School this week. Though that number is certainly inspiring on its own, is it simply the fact that we hosted more kids this year than last year? Is that the ultimate goal? Or do we hope for something more? Instead of we're busy doing stuff, Donna's story conveys that ministry is happening, that care for one another, faith development, and the seeds of faith that have been planted in our youth are taking root and beginning to grow. Thanks be to God. In this way, sharing a story like this leads for record enrollment to matter much less. Impact is the key and would be meaningfully important if there were 117 kids or 17 kids. Who tells the story? When sometimes this is different. The person closest to the impact of ministry is wonderful. Sometimes you can't always get that story. When my family moved to Ohio in 2015, on one of the first Sundays we visited a new congregation, the pastor shared a note during worship, and I don't have that note, but I do remember it well. It read something to the effect of, I visited your food pantry last week. Thank you for the bag of groceries. I never thought I would need the support of a food pantry, but recently lost my daughter and son-in-law to opioid addiction. Their 2 young children are now in my care. This isn't how I thought my life would turn out. Everything has happened so fast. I didn't have time to prepare. The staff at the food pantry were gracious. They gave dignity to my asking for help. Thank you. I wrote a check to the food bank while sitting in the pew that morning. We became members of this church that exemplified our values we shared. It isn't enough to simply know something. This story struck me differently than seeing a box score of how many people were served that week, or the pastor making an announcement from the pulpit that the food bank was short on funds. Those details are processed intellectually. They don't get much further than my brain. This story, from a personal experience, traveled that added distance from my brain to my heart and compelled me to respond. Hearing the story from this person's words was far more impactful than being told second or third hand. Their voice carried through their written words. The story wasn't about the growing volume of patrons served that week, but the vulnerability of one person, a person whose life had been turned upside down, who was in deep grief and confusion, yet was striving to rise above it all, to support her grandchildren who were likely reeling from their own traumatic experience. Through the short note, I empathized with their desperation and their gratitude for a safe port in a wild storm. It was all that was needed to assure me that this ministry was meeting a need in the community, that it facilitated with grace and compassion, and that my supporting it with a financial gift, even though a contribution was not asked of me, would enable this ministry to support and serve more people in need. Many of us have not ourselves experienced circumstances like this, and it can be difficult for people in our congregations to understand the magnitude, the severity, the need beyond physical need ministries that we're working with. And it doesn't limit to physical need ministries. Some of us have grown up in the church and rely on decades of faith experiences and biblical teachings to draw upon. But What if we didn't? How might we think differently if hope and grace and the assurance of salvation was not apparent to us? Stories help immerse our people in the impact of ministry. They narrow that gap of understanding by bringing people closer to the impact of ministry. What do you want your congregation to feel about your shared ministries? Be specific. Leave space for them to be part of the story. Giving time, talents, and treasure isn't a transactional exchange. We need to create space for the congregation to see themselves as effective partners in that shared ministry. Without asking, the food pantry note created lots of space for our congregation to respond. People may have, like me, responded with a financial gift. Some, no doubt, responded with an offer to volunteer, or others, it may have simply been a softening of their heart for the patrons of our food pantry. How and when and where do we share stories in the church? I like to say through lots of methods, everywhere and all the time. Begin with using those methods in your congregation that your people are most familiar with. Newsletters, worship, annual meetings. Gosh, wouldn't it be great if our annual meetings were such a showcase and celebration of the stories of what God is actively doing in and through our congregations, rather than a factual list of statistics and shrinking budgets? What if people were eager to attend the annual meeting because they could not wait to hear about the exciting impact their time, talent, and treasure had on our shared ministries? What if we normalized sharing these stories as part of our worship together? How might our faith communities be shaped by the telling and hearing of stories of God in our midst, of our lives being changed, of hope restored? You might do these kinds of sharing through temple talks or mission moments, live or recorded, but they could certainly be shared in many other places. How many of your congregations are in need of more volunteers? I suspect, since COVID, it's probably all of you. How many of you are looking to do for more stuff to do? Probably none of you. We position volunteer opportunities as more stuff to do, and not many people are looking for more stuff to add to their schedules. So one of my favorite ways of sharing stories is to share stories of volunteers. Why do they volunteer? How has their life been enriched through their volunteer experience? Using stories can help inspire others to volunteer in this way. So let's not make these volunteer opportunities simply doing more stuff, but part of faith building, living our core values in caring for one another and extending God's grace. Many of you are probably sending youth to National Gathering this summer, and maybe also summer camp experiences or other mission trips. It's pretty common for youth to return from these kinds of trips, and we ask them to stand in front of the church on Sunday morning and tell of their experience. It's an effective way for sharing on Sunday morning their story, at least for those who are attending in worship. But one of my favorite ways for youth to directly connect generosity of those who have supported them with the experience that they have and this will terrify your youth, so is to have them phone those givers during their trip or experience with a brief 4 sentences. The 4 sentences are, "Thank you for supporting me. Here's what we're doing today." Share a bit, a sentence about that. "This week, I'm learning," fill in the blank. And the 4th sentence, "Thanks again for making this experience possible." Now, suggesting this activity, I guarantee you, will terrify your youth. But when I present this to them, I assure them that they will almost always leave a voicemail message, and the impact of their phone call will be far more significant for both them and their supporters. And it doesn't take a lot of time, just a few minutes while you're gathering for the next meeting, between sessions, and all the youth do it together so they can also bond over that nervous energy. Another one of my favorite ways to share stories is at the beginning of every council meeting. Now, I know council meetings have a terrible reputation for being lengthy already, but hear me out. Invite one ministry leader to join the first 10 minutes of the council meeting to share a story of where they have seen God in their program, a story of a life changed, of God drawing near. After the story, provide 3 names and phone numbers of congregation members for the council person to call right then and tell the exciting ministry impact that they've just heard. It won't take long. Again, many of them will probably leave a voicemail message. But in some cases, they will reach someone and share that story in person. After a few months of calling different congregation members with each new story being shared, most of the congregation will have received at least 1 phone call, and in some cases, maybe 2 through the year. This act does several things. It shifts the ministry focus from doing stuff to why these ministries matter. It gets your people comfortable to share those stories and increases a sense of being part of that shared ministry, even if they're not the ones leading the youth group or the Bible study or teaching the Sunday school class. They feel part of it. And number 3, it focuses the council meetings on the important part of the work. Sometimes there are difficult decisions to be made or issues to address at those meetings, but starting the meeting by centering on the impact of ministry, of God at work in us and through us, will shape the conversations of the rest of the agenda. Now, before you say, "We could never do that," that would never work here. A church in Valparaiso, Indiana, I've worked with over the last several years, accepted this challenge to tell a story at the beginning of every council meeting and phone a few congregational members to share that story. They have continued this practice for 3 years now. And Pastor Tim tells me that they have a waiting list of ministry leaders wanting to come to a council meeting. I'm going to repeat that again in case you didn't catch that. They have a waiting list of ministry leaders wanting to come to a council meeting to share their stories. And council members look forward to starting their meetings in this way, even the making of the phone calls to relay the story. It has become meaningful work for them as church leaders. As a fundraiser prior to my GSB days, I was in the middle of a donor trip, having stopped to see a longtime friend in Western North Carolina. It was a whirlwind trip, and me covering a lot of miles over the course of a few days, blindly following a map I had printed at the office before I left. This is in the days before GPS. So far, it had been a successful trip in conversations with donors and navigating an unfamiliar region. As I shared my plan for the next day's route with my friend Lene, she alerted me to the series of construction and delays that I probably would encounter and recommended instead a different route. I made a few scribbled notes of her brief directions, interstates and highways that I couldn't picture in my mind, but trusted would appear at the right times as she had described them. On the road the next morning, I was running late for my lunch meeting in Lexington, Kentucky. Trusting vague directions for an unfamiliar route, no doubt, added to my anxiety. After an hour or two, I saw a sign for Charleston, West Virginia. My heart sank as the forgotten memory of this desire of my heart flooded my mind. I was so close, but crunched for time, there was no way I could stop to figure out how to work this into my route. I was despondent. If only I had better researched, maybe even bought an actual map. I drove the next 30 miles trying to cheer myself up, dismissing this childhood dream as foolish and naive. What did it matter anyway? The memory, having been long forgotten, now returning, was enough. In the years since, I had seen nearly all of those sites featured in that calendar long ago. I told myself it was a figurative premise of the idea, not the literal interpretation that mattered. And that's how I consoled myself as I crested the next hill, and the vision that laid out before me was exactly how I remembered that autumn picture decades before. The full autumn foliage and the distinctive gold dome of the Capitol building. A lump in my throat, I burst into tears. "You remembered," I whispered. "You remembered." People of God, these are the stories of our faith. They are the stories that remind us God is present, ever faithful. Even when we don't see, when our faith is tested and our trust begins to waver. We need these stories. They are worth finding, and they are worth sharing. One of the joys of my work with the Lower Susquehanna Synod coming in my work with our synod is an opportunity to grow giving and generosity in local congregations. I want to share with you that in August, the Lower Susquehanna Synod is joining GSB's program called Building a Culture of Generosity. Some of your congregations have already participated in this in the past, and Synod staff can help share a little bit more about that and their experiences. This program to grow generosity in your congregations begins in August, and registration is now open. If you're interested in more information about that, you can visit the Synod website for further details. So with that, I will pause us and open for any conversation or questions from the attendees about telling stories in your congregations.